The dusty streets of the frontier town buzzed with excitement that afternoon. Wagons lined the square, merchants shouted their prices, and ranch hands crowded around the wooden stage where the day's most awaited auction was about to begin. The smell of hay, sweat, and anticipation hung thick in the summer air. At the center of it all stood the prize that had drawn men from miles away, a wild, jet-black stallion. His muscles rippled beneath his shining coat, his nostrils flared as he fought against the ropes that restrained him. The animal was untamed, fierce, and every rancher in town knew. Whoever claimed him would hold not just a horse but a legend. Among the bidders was a man who kept mostly to himself, a tall, rugged rancher with weather-beaten skin and eyes that had seen more storms than clear skies. He had lost much in his life, but his ranch still stood, and he knew the stallion could change everything. With that beast under his saddle, his herds would grow, his land would be protected, and maybe, just maybe, he'd find a reason to dream again. The auctioneer raised his gavel, voice booming over the restless crowd. "Gentlemen, we begin the bidding at $100. Shouts filled the air as hands lifted, the price climbing higher and higher. The rancher stayed calm, his gaze locked on the stallion. He was ready. He would win. But then something unexpected happened. From the edge of the crowd, a young woman pushed her way forward. Her dress was worn, dust clung to her skirt, and her chestnut hair spilled loose beneath a faded bonnet. Her cheeks were flushed with desperation, her voice trembling but strong enough to silence the crowd. "Don't buy the stallion," she cried out. Every head turned. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, his gavel frozen in the air. Whispers ran through the crowd like wildfire. Who was she? And what business did she have at a horse auction? The rancher's eyes narrowed as the girl stepped onto the stage. Her hands shook, but her gaze burned with determination as she faced him directly. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "don't buy the stallion. Claim me instead, ranchers, and I'll ride beside you forever." The square erupted in shocked gasps. Men muttered under their breath, women clutched their children closer, and the auctioneer stammered in disbelief. Had they heard her right? The rancher stood frozen, his rough hands tightening on the brim of his hat. He had come for the stallion, not for this strange girl with fire in her eyes. Yet something in her tone, something in the way she spoke, pierced straight through him. Who was she? Why had she stopped him? And what secret bound her fate to the wild stallion no man could tame? As the dust swirled around the silent crowd, one thing was certain: the auction was no longer about a horse. It was about a choice that could change his life forever. The silence that followed her plea was heavier than the midday heat. Every eye in the square was fixed on her, this stranger who had dared to interrupt an auction with words that sounded more like a vow than a bargain. The rancher, still clutching his hat, couldn't take his gaze off her. The girl stood on the stage, her shoulders tense but her chin lifted. She wasn't afraid of the whispers, nor of the laughter that began bubbling from the crowd. "Foolish girl," one man spat, "trying to trade herself for a horse." Another snickered, "Maybe she's lost her senses." But the rancher didn't laugh. He saw something the others didn't. Pain hidden beneath her defiance and desperation carved deep into her voice. The auctioneer finally found his tongue. "Young lady," he said sternly, "this here is a horse auction. You've no place interrupting good men's business. Step aside, or I'll have you removed." Her eyes flashed. "No." She pointed toward the stallion, who was rearing against the ropes, eyes wide and wild. "He's not just an animal to be sold to the highest bidder. He belongs with me. If you buy him, you'll break us both." The rancher's heart thudded. Belongs with her? What did she mean? Someone from the crowd shouted, "Then who are you?" "Girl, speak plain." For the first time her voice wavered. She drew in a sharp breath and let her secret spill into the open. "My name is Clara. That stallion is mine, or was mine, before I lost everything." Gasps rippled through the square. Clara's hands trembled as she pressed them together. "My father raised that horse from a colt. We lived far beyond the river, on land too small for cattle but rich with grass for horses. That stallion, he was born the same season I was. We grew together. He's my blood, my soul." Her voice cracked. "When my father died, death swallowed our land. They took the stallion from me, dragged him here, and now they're trying to sell him like he's nothing more than flesh and muscle." Her words hung heavy in the air, silencing even the cruelest whispers. The stallion kicked at the ground as if her pain echoed through his own restless spirit. The rancher's jaw tightened. He knew the hard hand of loss, the sting of seeing everything you loved stripped away. And now, looking at Clara, he saw more than a desperate girl. He saw a fighter, someone clinging to the last thread of her family's legacy. But the crowd was unforgiving. A man barked, "Nonsense, horses aren't family, they're property, the auction will go on." Another sneered, "If she's so attached, let her buy him back." Clara's face burned, her voice breaking into a whisper. "I have nothing left, no land, no gold, only myself." She lifted her chin toward the rancher once more, her eyes glistening. "So I offer that. If you'll claim me instead of the stallion, I'll ride beside you forever. I'll work, I'll fight, I'll give you loyalty no man can buy." The words pierced through the rancher like a blade. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the square, waiting for his answer. His chest tightened. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected to be chosen for anything, not since he'd buried the last of his own hopes years ago. The auctioneer cleared his throat and tried to restore order. "Enough of this foolishness. The bidding continues." His gavel slammed the air. But the rancher raised his hand, steady and calm. "Hold." The crowd hushed instantly. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden planks, and for the first time his voice rang out, deep and unyielding. "If the lady speaks truth, then this ain't just a sale. It's a matter of honor, and I don't take honor lightly." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The stallion stilled for the briefest moment, ears pricking as though he too was listening. The rancher's eyes locked with Clara's, and in that gaze, questions burned. Could she be trusted? Was she truly tied to the beast? Or was she just another soul desperate enough to gamble with words? The auctioneer shifted uneasily. The crowd leaned in, hungry for what would come next. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of fire, the rancher realized something undeniable. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about a choice that could bind his lonely life to hers forever. The sun was dipping low by the time the auction ended. The rancher had not placed a single bid on the stallion. Instead, he had walked away with Clara at his side, the whispers of the townsfolk trailing them like dust in the wind. Some called him a fool, others muttered about scandal, but he paid them no mind. Clara walked silently, her bonnet pulled low, her hands clenched around the small bundle she carried. No more than a worn shawl, a comb, and a leather strap that once belonged to her father's saddle. Everything else in her life had already been taken. They reached his wagon, a sturdy old thing hitched to two tired mares. The rancher helped her up, though she hesitated before placing her hand in his. His grip was rough, calloused but steady. For a moment, she felt something she hadn't in months. Safety. The road to his ranch was long and quiet. Dust rose in thin clouds behind the wagon wheels as the fields gave way to rolling hills. Clara stared out at the horizon, clutching her bundle tight. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "You didn't buy him," she whispered. The rancher glanced at her. "The stallion." She nodded, her throat tightening. "He's all I had left. I thought, maybe if I begged hard enough, someone would see." His hands tightened on the reins. "I saw, but some battles can't be won in a crowd full of men with gold in their pockets. I wasn't about to fight them there." His jaw clenched. "A wild horse ain't tamed in a square. He's tamed with patience, far from the eyes of men who only want to break him." Clara's heart lifted just slightly. He understood. When they arrived at his ranch, the last light of day bathed the land in amber. The ranch sprawled across a wide valley, weathered fences, a modest cabin, a barn that leaned a little too far on one side, and pastures stretching toward the horizon. It was not wealth, but it was honest. As he helped her down from the wagon, Clara's breath caught. "It sounds beautiful," the rancher grunted. "It's work." That first evening he gave her a simple meal, beans, bread, and coffee. They sat at the wooden table in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. Clara noticed how little the house carried of warmth, no woman's touch, no family photographs. Just a man's life, worn and solitary. She finally dared to ask, "Why did you take me with you?" His eyes met hers, steady but unreadable. Because when you spoke, it wasn't just words, it was truth. And truth deserves a chance. Her cheeks warmed, though his tone was plain. She nodded, fighting back the sting of tears. The next morning, before the sun had even lifted its head, Clara awoke to the sound of boots on the porch. The rancher was already outside, saddling a horse. She hurried to join him, her dress hastily tied, hair tumbling loose. "I can work," she said quickly before he could object. "I grew up mending fences, tending animals. I'm not afraid of hard labor." He studied her for a long moment, then handed her a coil of rope. "Prove it." And prove it she did. Clara worked from dawn to dusk that day, mending broken boards on the fence, fetching water, even helping to wrangle a stray calf that had slipped the corral. Though her hands blistered and her arms ached, she refused to falter. The rancher watched quietly, testing her without words. When she finally stumbled back to the house, sweat-streaked and bone-weary, he handed her a tin cup of water. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a trace of something she hadn't heard before: approval. "You've got grit," he said simply. Clara looked up at him, chest still heaving, and for the first time in months, a smile touched her lips. Yet not everyone would see her presence as strength. That evening, as they drove cattle into the pasture, Clara caught sight of a pair of riders on the ridge. Neighbors, or perhaps rivals, watching, whispering, judging. The rancher's eyes hardened. He knew what the town would say: a strange woman at his ranch, working his land, eating at his table. Gossip was the sharpest weapon in the West, and once drawn, it rarely missed its mark. But when Clara met his gaze, a quiet fire in her own eyes, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't care what the town thought. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread. By the end of the week, every porch in town seemed to hum with the same story. The rancher had brought home a strange girl who had begged him at the auction. Some said she was no better than a beggar. Others claimed she had bewitched him, and a few muttered that she was nothing but trouble. Clara felt the sting of it the moment she stepped into town with him for supplies. Women turned their faces, pretending to busy themselves with baskets of flour. Men stared too long, their smirks sharp as knives. Children whispered behind cupped hands. Clara kept her chin high, but the rancher saw the way her fingers clenched around the handle of the flour sack she carried. He felt the heat rising in his own chest. The town had judged him before, lonely, strange, too quiet for his own good. But now they judged her too. At the blacksmith's, a man with a wide grin and narrow eyes leaned against the post. His name was Mason, a cattle baron whose wealth bought him power over half the valley. He tipped his hat mockingly at Clara. "So, it's true," he drawled. "The mighty rancher traded his silver for a slip of a girl instead of a horse. Bold choice. Though..." His eyes slid over Clara with a weight that made her stomach churn. "Some choices don't last long." The rancher's hand twitched near his belt buckle, but Clara stepped forward first, her voice firm. "I am not for your talk, sir, nor your jokes." The crowd chuckled, but Mason's grin tightened. "Careful, girl. Folks around here don't take kindly to strays. And a wild stallion, untamed, he'll end up in my corral soon enough, just like everything else in this town." With that, he tipped his hat again and sauntered away, leaving dust and unease in his wake. That night back at the ranch, Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she stitched a torn shirt. The rancher watched her silently until finally she broke. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe I am just trouble to you. You had a life before me, a name, a reputation. Now they mock you for taking me in." His brow furrowed. "Do you think I care what they say?" Her eyes brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. "You should. You're a man of honor. People respect you, but with me here, you'll lose that. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Her respect from the kind of men who sneer at a woman's courage isn't worth the dust on my boots. You worked beside me. You bled for this land. That's worth more than their words. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Clara's chest ached with the truth in his voice, but still, doubt gnawed at her heart. The days that followed were heavier. Clara threw herself into work, mending fences, milking cows, hauling water until her arms burned. She thought if she worked hard enough, perhaps the whispers would fade. But the rancher knew better. Gossip in a small town only grew. And then came the breaking point. One morning, Clara was in the pasture scattering feed when the stallion appeared on the ridge. Somehow, he had broken free from the men who'd bought him. His mane flew like fire in the wind, his hooves striking the earth with thunder. Clara froze, her breath catching. "Storm," she whispered, calling him by the name she had given him long ago. But before she could move, riders appeared on the ridge behind him. Mason's men. They chased hard, ropes in hand, determined to drag the wild beast down. The stallion reared, shrieking against the chase. Clara cried out, dropping the feed bucket. Without thinking, she ran toward the ridge, her skirt flying, her heart pounding. The rancher saw her from across the yard, his stomach lurching. He shouted her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, because in that moment she realized what Mason had meant in town. He wanted the stallion, and he would take him at any cost. And if he couldn't have the horse, perhaps he'd come for her next. The stallion's scream split, the valley like thunder. His hooves tore up the ridge, scattering rocks as he fought against Mason's men. The riders shouted, whips cracking, ropes flying through the air. But the beast twisted and lunged, too wild to be caught. Clara's heart pounded as she sprinted toward the chaos. Dust choked her throat, but she didn't care. That was her father's horse, her last tie to the life she'd lost. She would not let Mason chain him. "Clara!" The rancher's voice bellowed across the pasture. He was already mounting his gelding, spurring the animal hard. His blood roared in his ears as he rode to cut her off. But Clara was faster, fueled by something deeper than fear. Mason's men spotted her, and laughter echoed off the hills. "Look, there the girls come to fetch her pony," one jeered. Another swung his lariat toward her. The rancher's rifle barked once, the bullet kicking up dirt near the rider's horse. "Try it, and you'll find your rope around your own neck." His voice thundered. The men cursed, but Mason himself appeared at the ridge, tall in the saddle, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "Well, well," he called down, "looks like the girl wants to play hero, and the lonely rancher thinks he can stop me." Clara reached the base of the ridge just as the stallion reared, screaming, his hooves striking the air. For one terrifying moment he looked ready to trample her, but then his eyes caught hers. Recognition flashed, his ears flicked forward. "Storm," she whispered, holding her hands out, palms open. Her voice shook, but it carried the memory of years spent whispering into his mane, brushing his coat, feeding him from her hand. "It's me. You know me." The stallion's breath came hard, but slowly, impossibly, he lowered his head toward her. Clara stepped closer, tears spilling freely now. She touched his muzzle, soft and trembling, and he stilled beneath her hand. The wildness was still there, but it bent to her voice. To her. The rancher reined his horse to a halt, stunned by what he saw. She wasn't just calming the stallion, she was commanding him. Not with force, but with a bond no whip or rope could break. Mason snarled. "Enough of this." He raised his pistol and aimed straight at the stallion. Clara gasped. But before the shot could ring out, the rancher's voice cut like steel. "Drop it, Mason." His rifle was leveled, steady as bedrock, aimed squarely at the Baron's chest. "You fire on that horse or that girl, and you'll answer to me." The riders shifted uneasily. They knew the rancher's aim was true. Mason's eyes flicked between the rifle and Clara, who now stood proudly with the stallion at her side. The balance of power had shifted. "You can't keep what doesn't belong to you," Mason spat. The rancher's jaw tightened. "Funny. That's exactly what I was about to tell you." A tense silence hung over the valley. Then, with a snarl, Mason holstered his pistol and jerked his reins. "This isn't over. The horse, the girl, the land. You'll lose them all." He wheeled his horse, his men following reluctantly, their curses trailing in the wind. When they disappeared over the ridge, Clara collapsed against the stallion's neck, her body trembling. He nickered softly, nudging her shoulder, as if to tell her he was home. The rancher dismounted and strode to her side, his hand steady on her arm. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with more emotion than he meant to show. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes blazed. "I couldn't let them take him. He's all I have." For a moment they stood there, the girl, the rancher, and the stallion, bound together not by chance but by something far deeper. The rancher glanced toward the horizon where Mason had vanished. He knew the man would return, meaner and more determined than ever. But he also knew something else now. Clara wasn't just a burden or a desperate girl. She was a fighter, someone who had the courage to stand beside him in the storm. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd buried forever. Hope. The days after the standoff on the ridge felt strangely quiet, almost fragile, like the land itself was catching its breath. The stallion, Storm, now roamed the pasture near the barn, untethered, free yet never straying far from Clara's call. His presence alone shifted the rhythm of the ranch. The cattle were restless at first, uneasy with his wild energy, but slowly they grew accustomed to him, just as Clara and the rancher were growing accustomed to something new, each other. Clara rose earlier than before, eager to tend to the chores alongside him. She scrubbed floors, hauled water, stacked hay bales, and though her hands blistered, she wore her aches like a badge of pride. Often she would glance across the fields to where the rancher worked, his broad frame bent over fence posts or driving cattle, and feel a warmth swell in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was belonging. At night, they shared quiet meals by the fire. She cooked simple stews from beans and potatoes, and though the food was plain, he always finished every bite, telling her it was the best he'd had in years. She'd laugh softly, but each time her cheeks warmed. The rancher, for his part, watched Clara with a growing respect he hadn't expected. When she first arrived, he had seen her as fragile, a girl running from hunger, desperate for safety. But now he saw her strength. She worked with grit, never complaining, even when the sun burned her skin or her back ached from carrying water buckets. And when she stood by Storm, head high, eyes bright, she carried herself with the grace of someone born to ride the wind. One afternoon, he found her in the corral, standing with Storm. She wasn't holding a rope, just talking to him, her hand brushing along his neck. The stallion pawed the dirt but didn't pull away. "You planning to break him?" the rancher asked from the fence, his voice calm but curious. Clara shook her head, her braid swaying. "Not break, just remind him he's not alone. He doesn't need chains to stay. He only needs trust." The rancher leaned on the fence, studying her. "That's not how most men see it. They believe a horse is only useful once he's been tamed." She smiled faintly. Maybe most men never knew what it was like to be caged. The words hung between them, heavier than the air. The rancher thought of his own loneliness, of the years spent locking his heart away after loss. Clara wasn't just talking about the horse. She was talking about herself. The bond between them grew in small, steady moments. He taught her how to mend a saddle strap, his calloused hands guiding hers over the worn leather. She showed him how to braid rope tighter than he'd ever managed. He began to laugh again, short and gruff at first, but warmer each day. She began to sing while she worked, soft songs her mother had taught her, filling the house with a sound it hadn't known in years. But shadows still lingered. The rancher never forgot Mason's promise. He knew the cattle baron wasn't the kind of man to let go of what he wanted. Each ride across the range, he kept a watchful eye on the horizon, rifle never far from reach. Clara, too, carried a quiet fear. At night, she sometimes woke with a start, her hand reaching for Storm as if afraid he'd be gone again. One evening, as the sky burned gold with sunset, Clara and the rancher stood together by the fence, watching Storm graze. She turned to him, her voice soft. "You could have let me go that day in town. You could have let Mason take me or turned me away at your gate. Why didn't you?" The rancher looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady. "Because I saw something in you," Same as I saw in that horse, wild, wounded maybe, but not broken, and I reckon I needed reminding that I'm not broken either. Her breath caught, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name. Slowly, without words, her hand brushed against his on the fence rail. He didn't pull away. For the first time she felt not just sheltered by him, but chosen. And though the threat of Mason loomed like a storm cloud, in that moment, hope grew roots. The ranch no longer felt like a place of solitude. It felt like the beginning of a home. The peace on the ranch did not last. For weeks, Clara and the rancher worked side by side, Storm running free in the pasture. Their bond deepened in silence, in laughter, in small touches that spoke louder than words. Yet each day carried the shadow of a promise Mason had made. This isn't over. And Mason was a man who kept his word. It happened on a moonless night. The rancher stirred awake to the distant thud of hooves and the faint crackle of fire. By the time he reached the door, the glow of flames lit the horizon. The barn was burning. "Clara!" he shouted, grabbing his rifle as he ran. She was already there, bucket in hand, throwing water against the blaze. But the fire spread too fast, fed by oil Mason's men had poured across the straw. Storm reared inside the corral, screaming, his mane lit like fire itself in the glow. Figures moved in the dark. Mason's men, rifles slung, laughter sharp as knives. And then Mason himself rode forward, his smile cold, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "You should have listened, rancher," he sneered. "The horse is mine, and the girl, well, maybe I'll keep her too." Clara froze, fear slicing through her chest. But before the words could sink, the rancher stepped between them, his rifle steady. His voice was calm but laced with steel. "You'll leave now, Mason, or you won't leave at all." The two men locked eyes across the firelit yard, and the silence was heavier than thunder. Then Mason raised his hand and his men moved forward. The crack of gunfire split the night. The rancher fired, dropping one rider's hat clean off his head. Clara ducked low, pulling water onto the fire, desperate to keep it from consuming the barn. Storm shrieked again, slamming against the corral fence, desperate for freedom. "Clara!" the rancher roared. "Open the gate!" She sprinted to the latch, flames licking close. With shaking hands, she pulled it free. Storm exploded out of the corral, charging straight through Mason's men like a thunderbolt. Horses scattered, men cursing as the stallion reared, kicking with wild fury. The rancher used the chaos. He fired again, forcing Mason back. But Mason wasn't done. With a snarl, he leapt from his saddle, tackling the rancher to the ground. The rifle clattered away, and fists met flesh in the dirt. Clara cried out, torn between dousing the barn and running to him. Mason's strength was fueled by rage, and for a moment, it seemed the rancher might be overcome. But then Clara's voice cut through the fight. Strong, steady, certain. "Rancher!" He looked up, blood on his brow, just as she tossed him a branding iron pulled from the flames. He caught it in one hand, the metal glowing red-hot. With a surge of strength, he swung, stopping just short of Mason's throat. The iron hissed in the night air. Mason froze, his breath ragged, his face pale in the firelight. "Leave," the rancher growled, his voice low, dangerous. "Or the brand you've put on others will be the mark you wear forever." For the first time, Mason faltered. His pride was heavy, but his fear was heavier. With a curse, he scrambled back, signaling his men. One by one, they rode into the dark, leaving the barn smoldering and the ranch scarred, but still standing. Clara dropped the bucket, tears streaking her face. The rancher stumbled toward her, and she caught him, holding him close as Storm circled, snorting and pawing the dirt. "It's over," he whispered, his voice rough against her hair. "It's finally over." But Clara shook her head, pressing, her hand to his chest. "No, it's only beginning." In the days that followed, they rebuilt. The barn was blackened, the land scarred, but the ranch stood tall, stronger than before. Storm became more than just a horse. He was a symbol of freedom, a reminder that strength came not from chains, but from trust. And Clara. She was no longer the desperate girl who had begged a stranger to claim her. She was his partner. She worked beside him, laughed with him, dreamed with him. One evening, As the sun sank low, painting the sky with fire, the rancher turned to her. His hand brushed hers, rough and warm, and his eyes softened. "You said you'd ride beside me forever," he murmured. "Did you mean it?" Clara smiled, her heart steady, her voice sure. Forever, and beyond. Together, with storm grazing. Nearby they stood on the land they had fought for, and though storms would come again, they knew they would weather them side by side, not as strangers bound by chance, but as soulmates bound by choice. The lonely rancher was lonely no more.